Before we get into the actual topic of the video, consider liking and subscribing. In the description you can also find links to my blog, my Patreon, and all that other stuff. Also, I want to give a shout out to Dankey Kang, Ewoks Unhinged, and Morrin. They all make good content, so please check them out. Now let's get on with the video. Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. Today we will be continuing to study Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder. If you haven't seen the previous episodes, I recommend you do that first. It would be useful, though perhaps not absolutely necessary. So in chapter 2, Lenin was talking about things that allowed the Bolsheviks to become truly a revolutionary party that was capable of carrying out a successful revolution. How did they do that? Revolutions are difficult to do. Many revolutions have failed. Many revolutionary parties never get that far. They never truly become a revolutionary vanguard, and they never even attempt to carry out a revolution. So he was talking about how the Bolsheviks were able to do it. Of course, every revolution is a little different. Every country is a little different. Times have changed. But there are still some useful points that we can get from studying the Bolshevik Revolution and also every other revolution too. But the Bolshevik Revolution is a particularly good example of a successful revolution. And Lenin emphasized the importance of discipline and good organization. Only that way you can create a really firm and solid organization that functions smoothly. You can count on all your comrades. Everybody is knowledgeable enough, experienced enough. Everybody's on the same page about what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve. And he makes this point, quote, "The fact that in 1917 to 20, Bolshevism was able, under unprecedentedly difficult conditions, to build up and successfully maintain the strictest centralization and iron discipline was due simply to a number of historical peculiarities of Russia," unquote. So let's unpack that a little bit. What does he mean by the Bolsheviks were able to maintain strictest centralization and iron discipline in unprecedentedly difficult conditions? Well, the conditions, of course, were the time of the Russian monarchist police state, and then the revolutionary situation after that. When the Tsar was overthrown, he was replaced by the provisional government of Kerensky, who at first were a little bit more liberal and allowed more political freedom. But in July, because of big protests against the war, which the Kerensky government was still participating in, the Kerensky provisional government cracked down hard on the Bolsheviks, demolished their party office, their printing presses, banned their newspapers, outlawed the Bolshevik party, and tried to imprison and potentially kill Lenin. So they really attacked and smashed the Bolshevik party apparatus, and the Bolshevik party was once again forced to go underground. From there, the Bolsheviks reorganized themselves and eventually carried out a successful socialist revolution, the October Revolution. After the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks obviously had to smash the military resistance of the capitalist class and the landlord class and the monarchist forces, and then began the period of the so-called Allied intervention, when around 14 or 16 capitalist countries sent troops to invade Soviet Russia and to support the capitalist white armies in Russia to ensure that the Bolsheviks lose. And the reason there's a little bit of confusion about how many countries exactly sent troops is because, for instance, these included India, South Africa, as British territories, so you could class them under just the British troops. But basically Czechoslovakia, Great Britain, United States, France, Japan, Greece, Serbia, Italy, Poland, Canada, etc., etc. So these were unprecedentedly difficult times. In this context, what does strictest centralization and iron discipline mean? Well, I already talked about discipline. Centralization in this instance just means that there's one leading center. The party leadership is elected by the members. Usually that happens in a party congress, so every local party branch elects one or more delegates, depending on how big the local party branch is. Then they send their delegate to a party congress, and then in the congress the delegates elect the party leadership, so the central committee, politburo or executive committee, editorial board of the newspaper, etc., etc. So while it's democratic, still there is one leading center, and the purpose of that is to facilitate unity of action, leading people to one direction instead of having a number of separate, conflicting, contradictory leaderships, leading people into different directions. So that's just what centralization means. A good kind of centralization means that you're able to maintain cohesion instead of people splitting into different factions, or communications being split between various parts of the party so that different local leaderships emerge, which eventually lose touch with each other. Or, what is also very common is that the ground level, the local organizations, simply lose contact with the leadership, or they don't follow the instructions of the leadership. If they become separated from the leadership, then they might just react spontaneously, do whatever comes to their mind. And you can imagine if the party has like 30 local chapters and they're all doing different things that are conflicting with each other, and they might not even know what the other ones are doing, well, that would just be complete chaos, and that wouldn't amount to anything. Or, what is also very typical is that the local guys, on the ground level, the local party chapter, loses contact with the party leadership, and they don't know what to do. So they just sit there. They observe like, oh, look, the masses are demonstrating, the masses are doing that. So they just kind of lag behind the masses. They don't have a line of their own. They just sit there and watch, kind of apathetically or passively, waiting for instructions from the leadership. That was very common in the Finnish Revolution. Many of the local chapters in rural areas, for example, areas in the north of Finland, for example, they were very far away from the red leadership. And they were politically probably the least advanced. They weren't experienced enough or knowledgeable enough to have any initiative of their own. So they usually just sat there waiting for instructions from the leadership. And sometimes there would be conflicting leaderships, especially in the Finnish Red Guard military. People might be getting instructions from the Red Guard Central Command, but instead of following those, they wanted to wait for instructions from the Red Guard command in their hometown. Those were the people that they knew, those were the people they trusted, yada yada. Maybe this is a little besides the point, but I'm just trying to explain why Lenin emphasizes centralization is to avoid all those kinds of problems. So then, he says that the Bolsheviks were able to maintain this centralization and iron discipline because of a number of historical peculiarities of Russia. Now, what the hell does that mean? In the past, we've spoken about how Leninism is not just specific to Russia. Leninism is universally applicable to any place, not just Russia. So how could there be some kind of Russian peculiarity that contributed to it? This will become clear in a moment. So he explains, quote, "On the one hand, Bolshevism arose in 1903 on a very firm foundation of Marxist theory. The correctness of this revolutionary theory, and of it alone, has been proved not only by world experience through the 19th century, but especially by the experience of the seekings and vacillations, the errors and disappointments of revolutionary thought in Russia. For about half a century, approximately from the 40s to the 90s of the last century, progressive thought in Russia, opposed by a most brutal and reactionary Tsarism, sought eagerly for a correct revolutionary theory, and followed with the utmost diligence and thoroughness each and every last word in this sphere in Europe and America. Russia achieved Marxism, the only correct revolutionary theory, through the agony she experienced in the course of half a century of unparalleled torment and sacrifice, of unparalleled revolutionary heroism, incredible energy, devoted searching, study, practical trial, disappointment, verification, and comparison with European experience. Thanks to the political emigration caused by Tsarism, revolutionary Russia in the second half of the 19th century acquired a wealth of international links and excellent information on the forms and theories of the world revolutionary movement, such as no other country possessed. So, Bolshevism arose on a very firm foundation of Marxist theory. That's the first point. How did that happen? Well, because the situation in Russia was so intense, the class struggle was so intense, and the struggle against the monarchy was so intense, that they quickly went through a lot of development in the revolutionary movement. You can imagine that in a country where the class struggle is not that intense, not a lot of stuff would happen in a long time. But in Russia it wasn't like that. The situation was very extreme. There were huge mass movements, mass uprisings, big changes, and people tried all kinds of different methods and all kinds of different theories. And they got a lot of ideas from abroad, and they tried those as well, and this was made easier because so many people were emigrating from Russia to escape Tsarism that there was a big Russian emigre community in France and in the US and wherever. So they were able to form these links between Russia, the Russian emigre community, and the revolutionaries of other countries. And that's also why there were quite a lot of Jews in these socialist and other political movements at the time, because Russia was so anti-Semitic that especially all the Jews who had the money to leave pretty much wanted to leave. There was a mass migration of Russian Jews to the US, for example, already in the 1800s. So in the course of this development, they kept having intense class struggle, and they kept trying out different theories and keeping a close eye on other countries, seeing what theories are in other countries, and they kept trying those, and eventually they came to Marxism. And that eventually became pretty prevalent among the working class. In Russia, there was still one big competitor to Marxism, which was Narodism, a form of utopian socialism. There were Narodnik intellectuals, bourgeois and petty bourgeois intellectuals, who saw the peasantry as their mass base. Marxism, of course, was a little different. It saw the proletariat as its main mass base, although the Bolsheviks, as real Marxists, also saw the peasantry as an ally of the working class. And if you study the history of Bolshevism versus Menshevism, you'll see what Lenin means when he says that Bolshevism was based on a very firm foundation of Marxist theory. The Bolshevik-Menshevik split, all the early splits in Russian Marxism between the economists and the Bolsheviks and between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks and all that, those established the Bolsheviks as the real Marxists. Now this is Lenin's second point. Quote, "On the other hand, Bolshevism, which had arisen on this granite foundation of theory, went through 15 years of practical history, 1903 to 17, unequaled anywhere in the world in its wealth of experience. During those 15 years, no other country knew anything even approximating that revolutionary experience, that rapid and varied succession of different forms of the movement, legal and illegal, peaceful and stormy, underground and open, local circles and mass movements, and parliamentary and terrorist forms. In no other country has there been concentrated in so brief a history such a wealth of forms, shades, and methods of struggle, of all classes of modern society, a struggle which, owing to the backwardness of the country and the severity of the Tsarist yoke, matured with exceptional rapidity, and assimilated most eagerly and successfully the appropriate last word of American and European political experience." Unquote. Because of all those things, the development eventually led the Russian proletariat to Marxism, and from there, the Bolsheviks basically had 14 years to learn from a Marxist lens, from a Marxist point of view, from this situation. 14 years of theoretical debate and practical experience. And in the scope of history, that's a very short time. But the situation just was so turbulent that it allowed them to build up this understanding in a relatively quick period. And these examples he gives are very useful. So legal and illegal. Marxism itself was illegal in Russia, communism was illegal, and the military would be used against strikes and whatnot, but you could still do certain things legally. You could print certain things in legal newspapers. You could try to do certain kinds of legal organization. It was possible to be in the parliament at a certain point. Peaceful and stormy methods of struggle. Sometimes you're studying, sometimes you're just talking to people and teaching them. Sometimes it's riots, strikes, uprisings. Underground methods and open methods, that sort of corresponds to the legal and illegal. You could sort of agitate openly, but you also had to keep an underground party machine. The Bolshevik method was always to combine an underground party machinery with an above-ground party machinery. So they had their newspapers, which were illegal. They had their party, which was illegal. But they still took advantage of all the legal possibilities that they had. And of course, if you're only an underground movement, well, then you tend to be separated from the masses, because the masses are not in the underground. The masses are in their daily class struggle. They're working, they're protesting, they're striking, they're demanding better lives. They're doing whatever in the normal scope of daily life and the daily class struggle. So there were some opportunists like the liquidators and the economists who wanted to only do the above ground, open, reformist type of political stuff. And there were the Otsevists and various terrorists and Narodniks and whoever who just wanted to do the underground stuff. You're an underground revolutionary, you're hiding somewhere and then you're committing armed attacks against the state. But the Bolsheviks said, no, you can't just, that's not gonna work. You maintain the underground party apparatus because the party cannot exist legally, but you still try to use the legal possibilities, the public possibilities for a mass movement. But then when the time for revolutionary uprising comes, then you do that. So this is what he meant when he talked about the historical peculiarities of Russia. So it's not that Bolshevism is only applicable to Russia, or that the Russians are somehow different from everybody else. It's just that this Russian experience made it possible for Bolshevism to arise and become a political force. Because parties and theories, they don't just come out of nowhere, they come out of real objective conditions. Of course, you still shouldn't take that as completely fatalistically, like, oh, well, if this country is different from Russia in the 1800s and early 1900s, then revolution can never succeed. No, that's not correct. First of all, Bolshevik theory was created back then, but now we already have the theory, so we don't have to recreate the wheel. We already have the Bolshevik theory. Now our task is to master it and correctly apply it and correctly develop it. And the Bolshevik method, which arose from those conditions, by definition it also fit those conditions. But since conditions are different, we have to learn creative ways of using it.